Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Pam Gothel for around 6 minutes or so. Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to acknowledge the work of women's groups and communities across Scotland and indeed the world to tackle women's inequality. The work they do is important, often unpaid or underpaid, and sadly frequently undervalued by some, but it makes a difference and is in many cases life-saving. Thank you, sisters. If I can especially mention North Ayrshire Women's Aid and the North Ayrshire Violence Against Women Partnership, who are gathering with the wider community for a Reclaim the Night March in Irvine this evening. I'm sorry I can't join you. Presiding Officer, our debate takes place against a background of conflict and bloodshed around the world, and we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by war. With the focus this year on bias, I think it might be worth reflecting a little on our collective response, the rhetoric and action of governments, parliaments and indeed media coverage in regard to global conflicts and injustice. In Afghanistan, there remains a devastating humanitarian and economic crisis, with more than half the population suffering extreme levels of hunger, and the UN stating that an increase in child labour, child marriage and the sale of children has been observed. As was laid out eloquently by Gillian Martin, for Afghan women and girls, the actions taken by the de facto authorities have curtailed fundamental rights and freedoms, with women being excluded from the workplace and limitations on freedom of movement negatively impacting other aspects of their lives, such as access to health services. I don't think that war can be anything other than grotesque and unfair, but in Yemen, for nearly 7 years, a grossly asymmetrical war has seen Saudi bombs pummelling the country, sinking it into widespread famine and pushing it to the cusp of collapse. Instead of widespread condemnation, Yemeni women struggling for their very survival will have heard very little from the rest of the world. The war there has caused an estimated 233,000 deaths, including 131,000 from indirect causes such as lack of food, health service and infrastructure due to a Saudi-led blockade. In Palestine, ordinary Palestinian women and their families resisting state seizure of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah and other occupied territories are conflated with armed militants, meaning they're labelled and treated as terrorists. The recurring killing of civilians in Gaza by Israeli airstrikes is defended with the same excuses Putin's propaganda has adapted for Ukraine's invasion, that women and children are being used as human shields, and that justifies striking civilian targets. A shameful lie is just that, no matter who's telling it. Presiding Officer, these global events can feel entirely overwhelming without any powers over foreign affairs or immigration, but we are not powerless. I wonder if, as a nation, Scotland could direct some resource to one of the countries that is doing the humane thing and opening their borders and providing sanctuary. Europe's poorest country, Moldova, now has the largest proportion of refugees of any nation. Tens of thousands of people fleeing the Russian invasion have crossed its border from Ukraine, according to the country's Prime Minister. As of Monday, of the 250,000 Ukrainians that had crossed the border since the war began, 120,000 have remained in Moldova. Whilst in Scotland, our Parliament does not yet have the power to do something about the UK Government's pitiful response to the refugee crisis, we can raise our voices and say that Scotland stands ready to accept those fleeing conflict. I'm very grateful that our First Minister and her government do just that. Refugees are welcome here. We must also maintain pressure on the UK Government to step up and do the right thing. I saw a clip yesterday of the Home Secretary seeming to say that the reason for not letting folk in was that there were trafficking gangs operating in Cali. Yes, Home Secretary, there will be, and the direction of travel of your government with the Nationality and Borders Bill plays right into their hands. Pushing displaced, traumatised women to the edges of society makes them even more vulnerable to traffickers. Something that, according to Maria, a Ukrainian feminist activist, is already happening. In an interview published this morning with Julie Bindel, she speaks of organised gangs trying to abduct young women on the Ukrainian-Polish border, and of girls being abducted by pimps from German refugee camps. Sex trafficking is, of course, most prevalent in nations with legalised prostitution regimes. Another thing we can do right now. Scotland can make sure that there is no market here for these criminal gangs and sex traffickers to profit from by getting on with the job of adopting laws against sexual exploitation that are fit for the 21st century, making it a criminal offence to enable or profit from the prostitution of another person, tackling and ending male demand by criminalising paying for sex, and decriminalising and supporting victims of sexual exploitation. With no home, no money, no job, no resources, and very limited legal framework protecting them, these displaced women are the most vulnerable in the world. From our position of safety here, we owe it to them, as well as all the women and girls of risk at harm here, of taking every action we can, of using every power that we do have to make the changes that are needed. Presiding Officer.